Before the radar showed anything, before the orders were given, before anyone in that operations room fully understood what they were witnessing, there was only the sound, a low rumble, deep and mechanical and enormous. The kind of sound that doesn't ask permission before it enters your chest. It rolled across the desert floor at Langford Air Base like the leading edge of a storm that had already decided where it was going. Then underneath the thunder of turbofan engines pushing hard through dry Nevada air, a voice came through the radio, calm, unhurried, the voice of someone who had already made her decision long before she ever keyed the mic. Bravo 7, I see you, don't move. 6 words. And every person in that room stopped breathing at the same moment. Not because the voice was loud, not because it carried urgency. They stopped breathing because of what wasn't in it. No fear, no hesitation, no performance of confidence, the way you hear from pilots who are still working to convince themselves. Just a woman's voice cutting through static, speaking to 14 men pinned down in the dark with the same tone you might use to tell someone their coffee is ready. Colonel Warren Holt stood at the center of the room, 52 years old, silver at the temples, a face that had learned to show less over the years, not because he felt less, but because there were too many people in rooms like this one who needed him not to. He was looking at the radar display when the voice came through. For one moment, his hand stopped moving above the console. He stared at the single white dot crossing the screen, moving low, moving fast, moving directly toward the last known position of Bravo 7. No call sign logged, no clearance issued, no flight plan filed, just a dot and a voice, and 14 men somewhere out in the dark who were almost out of time. Warren Holt had not always been a man who stood at consoles. There was a version of him not so many years ago that sat in a cockpit instead, an F-16 pilot, 17 years of it, not the kind of career that gets written up in the base newsletter, but the kind that becomes part of a man's skeleton. The way he held his shoulders, the way his eyes moved across a room the moment he entered it, cataloging exits and angles without being asked. The way he could read a situation at altitude in the time it took most people to find their reading glasses. Kandahar ended that, not in the way the movies show it, no dramatic crash, no explosion, just a bad landing, a hard jolt, and a sound from his right knee that he would hear for the rest of his life in quiet rooms. 3 surgeries over 4 years, and the flight surgeons were always professional and always final. The cockpit was done. Langford was the next chapter, and Holt had written himself into it without complaint because complaint was not something he had much patience for in other people, and he refused to extend himself a courtesy he wouldn't give anyone else. But every morning before the staff arrived and before the phone started and before the machinery of command began turning, he walked to the south end of the base where an old F-16 sat on a concrete pedestal outside Hangar 3, a static display, paint fading at the wingtips, the canopy bolted shut. He would stand there for 3 minutes, sometimes 4, with his hands in his pockets and his face turned toward the cockpit. Not mourning, not performing nostalgia. Something quieter than either of those things. A conversation with something he used to be. Then he would turn around and go to work. He never explained it to anyone. No one ever asked. That was the man standing in the operations room at Langford on a Tuesday night in late October when the world became more complicated than anyone had planned for. Bravo 7 had been in trouble for 2 hours before anyone above their pay grade fully grasped what kind of trouble it was. 14 soldiers, a reconnaissance element, had moved into the Sierra Kilo corridor on what the briefing called a low-risk assessment route. The briefing was wrong. It became wrong around sunset when an enemy element that wasn't supposed to be in that sector turned out to be very much there and very much aware of Bravo 7's position. By the time the contact reports started climbing the chain, 3 men were wounded, their primary radio was destroyed, and the only working communications they had were being used to beg anyone who was listening for air support. The duty officer brought it to Holt at 22:13 hours. Holt read the contact report twice. Then he looked up at the tactical display. Bravo 7's last known position was marked in yellow. Yellow because they hadn't confirmed it in 11 minutes. In this kind of situation, 11 minutes was a long time. He turned to the room. 8 people, consoles lit, faces tight. What do we have in the air? The duty officer didn't waste words. F-35s are down, sir. Scheduled maintenance started at 1800. F-18As are mid-refuel at Nellis. Earliest availability is 40 minutes. 40 minutes, Holt looked back at the display. He didn't say what he was calculating because everyone in the room was running the same numbers and arriving at the same answer, and nobody wanted to be the one to say it out loud. Chief Master Sergeant Vern Decker was standing near the back wall. 61 years old, built like someone had assembled him from aircraft components, with hands that had spent 4 decades on A-10 maintenance and A-10 controls and everything in between. He had flown his last combat sortie over southern Iraq in 1991 and talked about those years the way men talk about things they loved and lost and made their peace with. Quietly, accurately, without sentiment. He spoke. "Sir, there's an A-10 pilot in the boundary zone. Contacted us 18 minutes ago saying she was available." Holt didn't turn around. "I need jets, Decker, not a tank with wings." "Yes, sir. Get me something with speed and precision, not something designed to absorb punishment." "Yes, sir." Nobody said anything else for 43 seconds. Holt watched the display. The yellow marker for Bravo 7 held its position. Holding meant they were still there. Holding meant there was still something worth sending aircraft toward. Then Specialist Owen Pruitt, 29 years old, the youngest person in the room by a decade, spoke up from his console without looking away from his screen. His voice was careful, the voice of someone who has learned to introduce difficult information at the right volume. "Sir, I'm showing an aircraft that just went airborne. No clearance logged, no flight plan in the system." He paused. "Call sign is Raven 13. Holt turned. "Pull it up." Pruitt's fingers moved across the keyboard. The search took 4 seconds. Then another 4. Then he sat back from the screen with an expression Holt couldn't immediately read. "Sir, the call sign is in the system, but the file—" He stopped. "The file what, Pruitt?" "It's been deleted, not archived, not retired, deleted manually. The deletion order is still in the log. It was executed by a 2-star authorization 3 years ago. No reason given, no associated name remaining in the record." 8 people in that room and not one of them reached for a keyboard. Whoever Raven 13 was, someone with significant authority, had gone to the trouble of making sure that name wouldn't appear in a routine search. That kind of deletion didn't happen by accident. It didn't happen for small reasons. It happened when someone wanted a door closed and locked and the key thrown somewhere inconvenient. The radar painted the A-10 crossing into the Sierra Kilo boundary, 300 feet above the terrain, below most radar coverage, following the ridge lines the way someone would who had studied them from every angle and knew every fold in the earth beneath them. Holt picked up the radio. "Raven 13, this is Langford Operations. You are flying without clearance. State your ID and return to base. Acknowledge." Static, then silence. "Raven 13, you are in restricted airspace without authorization. This is a direct order. Return to base." The radar showed the A-10 descending another 50 feet and adjusting course by 4 degrees. Locked on to Bravo 7's last confirmed position, like it had been given coordinates, it wasn't going to forget. Decker walked to the front of the room, not hurrying, the way men his age walk when they've decided something and rushing would just be theater. He stood next to Holt and looked at the display and said nothing for a moment. Then quietly enough that only Holt could hear, "She knows where they are, sir." Holt stared at the screen. The radio crackled. A different voice this time, scratched and compressed by distance but unmistakable in its urgency. "Langford, this is Bravo 7. We are taking direct fire. 3 casualties. Position is compromised. We need air cover. We are out of time. Please, anyone, we are out of time." Holt looked at the white dot on the radar, then at the yellow marker that was Bravo 7. The distance between them was narrowing at the speed of a plane that had already made its decision. He picked up the radio. He held it for 4 seconds. 4 seconds is not a long time, unless you are the person holding the radio. Unless you understand that what you say next will either follow the rules or follow your conscience. And you know those 2 things are pointed in different directions tonight. 4 seconds can feel like a conversation you are having with every version of yourself at once. The officer who follows procedure. The pilot who once knew what it meant to be low on options with people counting on someone to show up. The man who sits in front of a bolted shut canopy every morning before anyone else arrives talking to something he used to be. "Raven 13, you are cleared to engage." There was no reply. She had already started her run. What happened in the next 4 minutes and 17 seconds would be discussed at Langford for a long time afterward. Not loudly, not in official briefings or formal reports. In the way things get discussed when they don't fit neatly into any category the institution has prepared for. In hallways and over cold coffee, and in the voice people use when they are describing something they witnessed but still cannot fully account for. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon on an A-10 Warthog fires 30mm rounds at a rate that makes the word rapid seem inadequate. It is not precise the way a surgeon's scalpel is precise. It is precise the way a master carpenter is precise. The precision comes not from the tool, but from the person behind it, from 10,000 hours of understanding exactly what the tool will do and exactly what the target requires in the space between those two things measured in fractions of a second. 60 rounds fired, not 60 rounds per pass. 60 rounds total. 3 enemy artillery positions. 3 separate threat vectors. Target spacing that requires a pilot to calculate angles and timing and airspeed adjustments between firing solutions in the time it takes most people to read a sentence. 3 positions. Gone. Bravo 7's radio came alive. Not with a tactical report. With noise. The kind of noise 14 men make when they have been waiting to die, and something changes that arithmetic without warning. When you hear that sound through a compressed military radio frequency, filtered through static and distance, it still lands somewhere below the professional training. It gets past everything learned and reaches something older. The duty officer near the back of the room said something under his breath that was not in any military vocabulary. Nobody corrected him. Holt watched the radar. The A-10 was already pulling off target, already climbing away from Bravo 7's position, already moving with the purposefulness of a pilot who knows the work is done and has somewhere else to be. Not a victory lap, not a holding pattern waiting for acknowledgement, just done and leaving. Raven 13, Holt's voice on the radio. This is Langford. You are cleared to return. Please acknowledge and land at Langford for debriefing. Nothing. Raven 13, acknowledge. The radar painted the A-10 descending below the ridgeline to the west. The return disappeared into terrain clutter. The aircraft was using the hills the way a person uses a crowd. Not hiding, just not asking for anyone's attention. Gone. Pruitt said carefully, Bravo 7 is mobile, sir. Moving to extraction point, all 14 personnel accounted for. 14. All of them. Holt stood in front of the display and looked at the place where the white dot used to be, then at the yellow marker that was no longer yellow. Someone had updated Bravo 7's status. Green now, confirmed mobile, heading toward extraction. Decker was still standing next to him. She fired 60 rounds, Holt said. Yes, sir, 60. That's what the feed shows. Holt turned to look at him. Decker's face was the face of a man who had been flying A-10s and working alongside people who flew A-10s for 4 decades. A man who knew in his bones exactly how extraordinary that number was for that result. Get me everything on Raven 13 by morning, Holt said. Everything that can be found. Everything that was deleted. I don't care how deep you have to go. Yes, sir. He walked back to the center of the room. Somewhere out in the dark, 14 soldiers were moving towards safety because of something that wasn't supposed to happen. An aircraft that wasn't cleared. A pilot who wasn't listed. A call sign that someone had gone to the trouble of erasing from every record they could reach. He looked at the empty radar display for a long moment. Then he went back to work. The call came in at 0340, an auxiliary field at the edge of the base property. Strip A-17. Tarmac kept for overflow and emergency use and mostly ignored in ordinary operations. The security detail covering it that night had almost called it in earlier, but wasn't certain enough of what they were seeing in the dark to justify waking anyone up. By the time Holt arrived, the A-10 was sitting at the far end of the strip, engines cold, canopy closed, no ground crew, no maintenance personnel, no pilot in sight. He walked the length of the aircraft with a flashlight, the chief of the security detail, 2 steps behind him saying nothing because Holt had that effect on people when he was thinking. The aircraft was old. The airframe had years on it, but the condition of it stopped Holt at the first wing and kept him there for a long moment. This wasn't a plane that had been neglected or abandoned or treated as a disposable tool. Every panel was tight, every surface was clean, in the way that takes sustained and deliberate effort over a long period of time. The paint was worn in places, but the underlying metal was protected. Someone had been taking care of this aircraft with the kind of attention you give to something you consider worth keeping. He climbed the ladder to the cockpit. The canopy was unlatched. He swung it open and looked inside. The cockpit was clean, organized. The instrumentation had been modified in places, not factory configuration. Someone had made changes that suggested they understood these systems at a level beyond the operator's manual, that they had thought carefully about what they would need and what they could do without and had rebuilt accordingly. Even to Holt's eye, this was not a stock aircraft. This was something that had been worked on by someone who knew it the way a musician knows an instrument they have played for 20 years. He was about to step back down when the beam of his flashlight caught something on the left seat. A pin. Small, metal. The kind of pin attached to a flight suit or a jacket. Worn at the edges and scratched across the face in the way that means it has been handled many times over many years. He picked it up carefully and held it under the light. An A-10 wing pin, the kind a pilot receives after completing their first combat sortie, a small and specific tradition, meaningful to the people who carry them, not something you leave behind by accident. He turned it over in his fingers. The scratches on its surface weren't random. They were the marks of something gripped tightly in moments when someone needed something physical to hold on to. The wear was concentrated in the places where a closed hand presses hardest. Someone had carried this for a long time. Someone had reached for it in difficult moments more times than could be counted. He stepped down from the ladder and stood next to the aircraft in the desert dark, the pin still in his hand. To the east, the sky was beginning to lighten at the very bottom edge. He walked back to the operations building. Pruitt had been at his console all night. 2 empty coffee cups. The expression of a man who had stopped being tired somewhere around 0200 and moved into a state past it. He looked up when Holt came in. The aircraft registration, Holt said. Sir, I found it. Something in Pruitt's voice that wasn't quite discomfort, but was adjacent to it. The tail number on the aircraft at A-17 matches a registration in Air Force material records. He paused. It matches an A-10 officially declared destroyed in a warehouse fire at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, Arizona, 3 years ago. Holt looked at him. The fire was logged, the aircraft was insured, the material loss was processed, and the file was closed. According to every record in the Air Force inventory system, that aircraft ceased to exist on April 9th, 3 years ago. Pruitt looked at his screen, then back at Holt. But it's sitting on our runway, sir. A different quality of silence now. Not the silence of people watching something remarkable happen. The silence of people trying to hold 2 facts in their heads at the same time and finding that the 2 facts don't fit in the same space. An aircraft that didn't exist on paper. A call sign deleted by a 2-star general. 60 rounds fired with a precision that had no ready framework. And a pilot who had walked away into the dark without asking for anything. Holt opened his hand and looked at the wing pin lying in his palm. The worn edges. The weight of something carried a long time. He set it on the console next to Pruitt's keyboard. Pull every personnel file ever associated with that call sign, he said. Not just the current system. Go back. Archived records, decommissioned units, anything predating the deletion. Find me a name. He paused. Also find me the record of the Tucson fire, the investigation report, the insurance documentation. I want to know who signed off on the destruction claim. Pruitt nodded, already turning back to his screen. Holt walked to the window overlooking the flight line. The sky to the east was fully lightening now, the desert turning from black to that pre-dawn gray that makes distances hard to judge. Somewhere out there, an aircraft existed on a runway that was not in any official record. Somewhere out there, a pilot was moving or waiting with the patience of someone who had been waiting a long time and was comfortable with the practice of it. 14 soldiers were alive, 60 rounds fired, a call sign deleted by someone with enough rank to do it quietly. He looked down at the wing pin on the console. He thought about the distribution of the scratches, the places where the grip would be tightest, the moments a person reaches for something small and holds on. He thought about the cockpit of a plane with the canopy bolted shut. He thought about what it means to do something right and then be told it was wrong. Decker, he said without turning from the window. Sir, when you get a chance, go take a look at the aircraft at A-17. Tell me what you see. Already planning on it. Outside, the first full light of morning was coming across the Nevada desert. Inside, the computers were working, and Pruitt was working, and the answer to a question Holt hadn't known he was going to ask. Yesterday was getting closer. He didn't move from the window for a long time. He stood there in the early light, watching the flight line with the image of that radar display still sharp in his mind. A single white dot, no call sign, no clearance, no history in any accessible system. Just a dot moving low over the desert with absolute certainty of direction, as if it had always known exactly where it needed to be. And then the voice, the first thing before any of the rest of it, speaking to men who had stopped expecting anyone to say anything at all. I see you. Don't move. Behind him, Pruitt said quietly, Sir, I've got a name. Holt turned away from the window. The wing pin was cold in his hand. The name came back at 0611. Pruitt set the printed page on the console without saying anything. One sheet. Holt looked at it. Captain Rachel Avery, A-10 pilot, 14 years of service at the time of separation, decorated twice for combat operations. Assignment history through 3 different bases and 2 combat deployments before the record ended abruptly. No retirement designation, no medical separation, just a line reading administrative separation, conduct unbecoming, and a date 3 years prior, and below that nothing. The rest of the file was blank, the way a sentence is blank when someone has removed every word after a certain point. Holt read it twice. Then he set the page down and looked at Decker, who had come back from was 17 an hour earlier and was standing with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup saying nothing because he had learned long ago that silence after significant information was more useful than noise. "Tell me about Iron Ridge," Holt said. Decker put his coffee down. He pulled out a chair and sat. That was unusual. Decker did not sit in operational briefings as a rule, to know. The fact that he sat now told Holt something about the weight of what was coming. He spoke slowly, not because he was uncertain of the facts, because some facts deserved to be carried carefully. Operation Iron Ridge had launched in the early morning hours of a September 3 years ago. A mixed squadron, 6 aircraft. The mission briefing described the threat environment as moderate. SAM coverage in the operational zone was assessed as light and degraded. Enemy air defense capability was listed as limited. The pilots flew their briefing. They flew the routes they had been given. They flew into a threat environment that bore no resemblance to the one they had been told to expect. The first SAM acquisition happened 14 seconds after the lead aircraft crossed into the operational zone. By the time the squadron could react, 2 planes were already hit. By the time any kind of defensive response was organized, 4 more were gone. 6 aircraft in the opening minutes. 22 crew, some killed immediately. Some who survived ejection and made it to the ground. 18 men on the ground in hostile territory, spread across 30 square miles of terrain. No reliable communications. GPS jammed by equipment that, according to the pre-mission intelligence assessment, was not supposed to be in that sector at all. The Rescue Coordination Center ran the numbers. The SAM coverage that had destroyed 6 aircraft was still active. Any rescue attempt would be flying into the same environment that had just killed 22 people. The assessment came back quickly. The conclusion was documented in language that was precise and professional and final. Accept losses. All further rescue attempts suspended. 18 men left in place because the arithmetic said it wasn't worth it. Holt said nothing. Decker continued. Rachel Avery had been on the ground at the forward operating base when the contact reports started coming in. She had not been part of the original Iron Ridge package. She was on standby waiting for a separate tasking that had been postponed. She heard the radio traffic. She pulled up the maps. She sat with what she knew about A-10 performance in SAM envelope geometry and the terrain in that sector, and she did the same calculations the Rescue Coordination Center had done, and she arrived at a different answer. Not because her arithmetic was better, because she was asking a slightly different question. The Coordination Center had asked, what is the risk of sending aircraft into this environment? Rachel Avery had asked, what is the cost of doing nothing? She walked to her aircraft. She did not request clearance. She did not inform her commanding officer. She did not file a flight plan or submit a risk assessment or perform any of the procedural things the institution requires before an aircraft leaves the ground. She climbed into the cockpit, started the engines, and took off. She flew 17 sorties in 8 hours. No GPS. The jamming that had killed the Iron Ridge package was still active. She navigated by terrain features and memory and the spatial knowledge that lives in the body after enough hours of low-altitude flying in difficult country. She flew below SAM engagement altitude wherever the terrain allowed it, and where it didn't, she flew fast and unpredictably with the understanding that she was making herself a target and that making herself a target was the point. Every time she was airborne, she was drawing attention, drawing fire, giving the men on the ground a few seconds, a few minutes of reduced pressure while the enemy's attention was pointed upward instead of outward. Between sorties, she refueled fast and went back. On the 17th run in the last hour of light, she was hit, not a glancing blow. The hydraulic system was compromised. One engine failing, navigation equipment gone. She had coordinates for the last surviving man not yet extracted, and she had read them into her personal recorder before takeoff because she had understood by that point that she might not be coming back, and she wanted the information to exist somewhere outside her own memory in case her memory stopped. She found him anyway. She circled long enough to confirm the extraction team had the position. Then she turned west and flew on one engine and degraded hydraulics toward anything flat enough to put a plane down on. She found a state road 20 miles from the base. She brought the A-10 down on it, hard. The gear held for most of the roll and then didn't. The aircraft came apart on the pavement in the way aircraft do when there is not enough of the necessary things working anymore. She walked out of it with 2 cracked ribs and a gash above her left eye and 18 people alive who had been designated acceptable losses by the institutions she served. The court inquiry convened 11 days later. She was offered an arrangement. Accept the reprimand. Acknowledge the unauthorized sorties. Accept the administrative consequence. Keep flying. She declined. Her statement at the inquiry was 4 sentences. Decker recited them from memory quietly the way people recite things they have carried a long time. I am not able to apologize for recovering 18 personnel. I acted within my capability and my conscience. If the institution considers that conduct unbecoming, I accept the institution's judgment of my conduct. I do not accept its judgment of my decision. They separated her 30 days later. She vanished. No forwarding address logged with the personnel system. No contact information updated. Just a woman who had been a decorated combat pilot for 14 years, walking out of a military installation for the last time, and becoming, as far as any official record was concerned, someone who no longer existed in this context. Holt sat with that for a moment. Who ran the inquiry? He said. Decker looked at him steadily. That's the part Pruitt found this morning. Holt turned to Pruitt, who had been sitting at his console through Decker's account with an expression Holt was only now reading properly. Not the expression of a man absorbing new information. The expression of a man hearing a story he already knows, told aloud for the first time. The inquiry was convened under the authority of Major General Clifton Brower, Pruitt said. He signed the separation order. He signed the administrative conduct designation. A pause, precise and deliberate. He also signed the stand-down order during Iron Ridge, the one that designated the 18 survivors as acceptable losses. Holt let that register fully before he said anything. Same signature, he said. Yes, sir, both orders. The stand-down and the separation, same hand. Pruitt looked at his screen. And there is a third document, the pre-mission intelligence assessment for Iron Ridge, the one that describes SAM coverage as light and degraded, the one that turned out to be wrong. He stopped. It was reviewed and approved by Brower's office 6 days before the mission launched. Decker put his coffee down. The shape of it settled in the room with the weight of something solid. Not an accusation, not a conclusion, a shape. The shape of a situation in which one man's authority had produced the conditions for a disaster, and that same authority had then been used to designate the survivors of that disaster as acceptable losses, and then used again to remove the person who had refused to accept that designation. Holt thought about what Brower had been then. Major General, 2 stars. He thought about what that rank became over 3 years of continued service. 3 stars now. Lieutenant General, Pentagon. The position from which a 2-star authorization code can be used to erase a call sign from a database, and the erasure is processed without question because the rank attached to the order makes questions unlikely. He was about to speak when Owen Pruitt stood up. Pruitt did not stand up in briefings. He delivered information from a seated position efficiently and waited for direction. Standing was outside his established pattern. The room registered this immediately. Pruitt did not look at his screen. He looked at Holt. The careful professional neutrality he maintained during operational briefings was still present at the surface. But underneath it, something else was working, the way current works beneath water that looks still from the bank. Sir, he said, there is something I need to tell you. I should have told you this morning. I did not because I was not certain how to account for it within the investigation. He paused. I have decided that telling you the truth matters more than accounting for it correctly. Holt waited. I was at Iron Ridge. Pruitt's voice was level, controlled in the way things are controlled when they have required practice to be controlled. I was a specialist assigned to the tactical communications element. I was in the second vehicle when the contact happened. I was one of the 18. He stopped. She found me at 1740 on the second day. I was in a drainage ditch 200 meters from an enemy patrol conducting a grid search. She came over low enough that I could read the stenciling on the underside of the wing. She waggled the aircraft, let me know she saw me. Then she drew the patrol north and held their attention long enough for the extraction team to reach me. Nobody said anything. I requested reassignment to Langford 18 months ago, Pruitt continued. Not randomly, specifically, because I knew Captain Avery had been using this base's communications infrastructure as part of a monitoring network. I wanted to be part of that network. He looked at Holt without flinching. For 3 years, sir, I have been monitoring mission status reports through channels accessible to me in my technical role here. When a mission was canceled or suspended due to risk assessment, I passed that information through a secure contact to Captain Avery. She then made her own determination about whether to respond. The kind of silence that comes after something irreversible has been said. How many times, Holt said? 17 times, sir. Each mission she flew followed a cancellation. Each time she received notification through our network before she departed. He paused. The network is 4 people. All of us were at Iron Ridge. All of us are alive because of her. None of us were asked to participate. We chose to. Holt looked at him for a long time, long enough that Pruitt did not look away, which Holt noted and respected. You have been running an unauthorized intelligence operation from inside this base, Holt said. Yes, sir. Using access privileges assigned to you in your official capacity. Yes, sir. To support a pilot administratively separated from the Air Force 3 years ago. Yes, sir. Pruitt's voice did not change. 67 people are alive, sir, between Iron Ridge and the 17 missions afterward. I have kept count. The number landed differently than the others, not as data, as something that required a different response than data. Holt looked at it and felt its weight and did not say anything immediately. Decker from his chair near the wall said nothing. He was looking at the floor. Holt turned and walked to the window. The flight line outside was fully lit, the morning well-advanced maintenance crews moving with the efficient purposefulness of people who understood their role in the machinery. Normal. Ordinary. The surface of a day that was underneath nothing like ordinary. He thought about Brower, about the specific arithmetic of a stand-down order, about the way institutions perform their calculations and arrive at their conclusions and document those conclusions in language designed to survive scrutiny, about what it meant to be on the other side of that arithmetic, to be the denominator in someone else's risk equation, to have your survival designated as a probability that didn't clear the threshold. He thought about a woman flying 17 sorties in 8 hours with no GPS and active SAM coverage because she had done her own arithmetic and arrived at a different answer. Then Pruitt said, "Sir, there is one more thing, with your permission." Holt turned from the window. Pruitt reached into the lower drawer of his console and removed a small digital recorder. Old model, the kind that runs on standard batteries and records to a memory chip and has no wireless capability and no network connection. The kind you choose when you want a record that exists only where you put it and nowhere else. She gave this to me 6 months after Iron Ridge, Pruitt said, before I was reassigned here. She said to keep it somewhere it would not be found and to use my own judgment about when it mattered. He set it on the console. I think it matters now. He pressed play. What came through the speaker was not clean audio. It was the audio of a small personal recorder inside an aircraft cockpit under combat conditions, which meant it carried everything. Engine noise, airframe vibration, the full acoustic texture of a pressurized environment working hard. And underneath all of that, a human voice, Rachel Avery's voice. The same voice that had come through the Langford radio the night before, but different in a specific way. The calm on the radio the previous night had been professional. The calm on this recording was something more fundamental. The calm of a person who has moved past the point where fear has anything useful to offer and has arrived somewhere quieter on the other side of it. The timestamp was her 17th and final sortie over Iron Ridge. She was narrating into the recorder. Not for an audience, not for a report. For the same reason people write things down when they are not certain they will survive, to say them aloud. She was reading coordinates. Grid reference 447, Bravo. The position of the last survivor she had not yet confirmed extracted. She read them twice, slowly and precisely with the phonetic clarity of someone who understands that the information has to be usable by whoever finds the recording. She stated the last known status of the man at that position. She stated the time. She stated her own heading and fuel state. Then, if I do not make it back, the information on this recording is complete. Someone needs to go to 447 Bravo. He is there. He needs to be brought out. The recorder ran in the silence after that for a moment. Then the audio changed. The steady engine note shifted. A warning tone started, low at first, then compounding, the hydraulic pressure alarm, the secondary engine fault indicator, the cascade of sounds an A-10 makes when it has absorbed more than it was designed to absorb, and the systems are beginning to fail in sequence, not catastrophically, just steadily. One thing after another, going from working to not working in the unhurried way of machines that have given what they had to give. The warning tones continued. The airframe vibration increased in a way that translated through the recording as a roughness in the sound. And then not into the recorder, not as a statement for any record, just spoken aloud in an empty cockpit, because sometimes a person needs to say something true out loud, even when no one is listening. The voice was quiet, almost lost under the engine noise and the alarms. But Pruitt had positioned the recorder correctly and turned the volume to the right level, and every person in the room heard it. Come on, one more time. Then the sound of wheels touching pavement. Hard. The protest of landing gear at a speed and angle it was not designed for. The long, grinding deceleration of an aircraft coming apart on a rural road in the Nevada desert with nobody watching, and nothing but flat ground and distance ahead of it. Then silence. The recorder ran for 11 seconds after the aircraft stopped moving. 11 seconds of complete quiet except for the small sounds of cooling metal and the distant nothing of open desert. Then Pruitt reached over and stopped the playback. The recorder ran 11 seconds after the aircraft went silent. Nobody stopped it. Decker had turned away from the console at some point during the recording. He was facing the wall, one hand on the edge of a cabinet. His shoulders were the shoulders of a man who had spent a career deciding what he was going to feel and when he was going to feel it, and who was currently losing that negotiation. Holt had not moved from where he was standing. He was holding the wingpin. He did not remember picking it up from the console where he had set it. It was in his right hand, the scratched face pressing against his palm. He looked down at it. He understood now why the scratches were where they were. Not time, not carelessness, not the ordinary wear of a thing kept in a pocket, the concentrated wear of something gripped hard in the dark. In the cockpit of an aircraft before a sortie that might be the last one. In the quiet before the engines start and the decision becomes physical and real and irreversible. 17 times that wingpin had been in her hand before she took off over 3 years of missions that the institution had canceled, and she had answered anyway. She had left it in the cockpit the night before. Not forgotten, left. He thought about that for a long moment. Then he set the pin carefully back on the console and looked at Pruitt. Pruitt was still standing, still meeting his eyes with the steady look of a man who had made his calculation and was prepared to live with whatever came from it. 67 people, Holt said. Yes, sir. He was quiet for a moment longer. Get me the full documentation. Every mission, dates, coordinates, outcomes, everything you have from the network. I have it ready, sir. Holt looked around the room at the people in it, at Decker, who had turned back from the wall, face composed again in the way of a man who has spent 61 years learning when to let something show and when to put it away. At the duty officer and the communications technician and the 2 analysts who had been there for all of it, looking at him with the look of people waiting to understand what kind of day this was going to become. Nobody in this room discusses any part of this investigation outside this room, Holt said. Not the call sign, not the separation record, not the recording, not the network, nothing. Until I determine the appropriate next step, this information stays here. He let that land. Understood. The room answered together. He picked up the wingpin again, turned it once in his fingers, set it down in the same spot. He thought about a 2-star signature on 3 different documents, a disaster, a designation, and a dismissal. He thought about the specific confidence that rank produces in a person over time. The confidence that says the story I have decided to tell is the story that will stand. He thought about 67 people who were alive and going about their lives because someone had decided that the story was not finished yet and had spent 3 years proving it one mission at a time. Outside the window, the Nevada morning continued, and somewhere in the desert or on a road or in a place that did not appear in any official record, Rachel Avery was either moving or waiting, with the patience of someone who had been patient for 3 years and understood that the most important things sometimes require exactly that long. Decker, he said. Sir, that aircraft at A-17, in your assessment, is it flight ready? Decker considered this for exactly as long as it required. Yes, sir, better than flight ready. He paused. Whoever has been maintaining that aircraft, sir, I would put their standard alongside the best maintenance crews I have worked with in 40 years. That aircraft is ready to fly right now, today, without a single additional hour of work. Holt nodded. He had thought initially that Raven 13 was the story of a rogue pilot, a person operating outside the system from anger or grief or the recklessness of someone with nothing left to lose. He was beginning to understand that it was a different kind of story. Not recklessness, its opposite. The most patient, deliberate, long-prepared, thing he had encountered in a career full of people who planned carefully and executed under pressure. Someone had been waiting and working and building something that could not be argued with because it was made entirely of results. He looked at Pruitt. She knows the investigation has started. I believe she does, sir. And is that why she flew last night to initiate it? Pruitt thought about this carefully with the same honesty he had brought to everything else. I think Bravo 7 needed help and she gave it. And I also think she understood the consequence. That a mission this visible, this documented, would open this file, open this conversation. He paused. I believe both things are true at the same time, sir. Holt looked at the empty radar display for a long moment, then quietly, almost to himself. She was not running, she was timing it. Outside the window, the morning continued, and the answer to the question of who Rachel Avery was and what she had spent 3 years building was no longer something Holt was going to be able to leave alone. He looked at the wingpin one last time. Then he went to find out what came next. The documentation arrived in 3 separate folders. Pruitt had been building it for 18 months. Not because he knew exactly when it would be needed, because he understood that the kind of truth that can be denied when it exists only in memory becomes considerably harder to deny when it exists on paper. Dates, coordinates, mission cancellation orders pulled from official channels and set beside the timestamps of Rachel's departures. Extraction confirmations, survivor counts, outcome reports that the institution had filed without understanding what had made those outcomes possible. He had assembled it all with the patience of someone who had spent 3 years waiting for a moment he could not schedule, but knew would come because she would make it come. Holt spread it across the long table in the briefing room adjacent to the operations floor. All of it, 17 missions in sequence, each one beginning with a cancellation order signed at the appropriate command level. Each one followed within hours by a Rachel Avery departure. Each one ending with people alive who had been designated unrecoverable. He stood at the table without speaking. Decker stood across from him. Pruitt sat in the corner. The thing that struck Holt, looking at all 17 missions spread out together, was the consistency. Not just that she had done it, the way she had documented it. Each mission recorded with identical precision. Coordinates accurate to a meter. Timestamps logged to the minute. Survivor counts certified against official extraction reports. So there was no ambiguity, no space for anyone to argue with the numbers. She had not been keeping a personal journal. She had been building a case file. This is not a log, Holt said. This is an evidentiary record. Decker looked at him over the table. Yes, she has been building this since Iron Ridge. That would be my read. Holt thought about the shape of that. 3 years, 17 missions, each one documented not just as a record of what she had done, but as a record of what the institution had refused to do. Each cancellation order preserved not as a grievance, but as a data point. Evidence that the pattern she had identified at Iron Ridge was not an isolated failure, but a repeating one. A system that, when confronted with risk and uncertainty, defaulted to a calculation that consistently arrived at the same answer. Stand down, accept losses, preserve the institution's resources and reputation above the individuals inside its care. And beside every one of those answers, her different answer. Not argued, not stated, demonstrated. He looked at the folders for another moment. Then he said, pull everything we have on Brower, current position, current responsibilities, any travel plans logged to this region. Pruitt ran the query. He was quiet for a moment reading the result. Then he looked up with the expression he had used the previous morning when delivering information he wasn't sure anyone wanted. Sir, General Brower's office filed a travel notification this morning. He is currently airborne, destination listed as Langford Air Base. A pause. ETA is approximately 90 minutes. Decker straightened in his chair. He knows the file is open, Holt said. He does not know how far we have gotten or what Pruitt has. He looked at the folders. He is coming to manage it before it gets somewhere he cannot manage it. He stood at the table and thought about Brower the way you think about an opponent when you need to understand them accurately and without the distortion of dislike. Clifton Brower was not a stupid man. He had not reached 3 stars by being careless or underestimating situations. He had reached 3 stars by being, for the most part, very good at the work, at the mathematics of operational command, at allocating risk with the dispassion the role required. Iron Ridge had been a failure of intelligence, not of calculation. He had calculated correctly from the information he had. The information had been wrong, and the information had passed through his office, And those two facts were connected in a way he had spent 3 years ensuring stayed buried. What Brower was Holt thought was a man who had made a decision he could not take back and had then spent 3 years building a structure of authority and silence around that decision. Not out of malice, out of the self-protective logic of someone who understood that if the structure fell, everything above it fell with it. The 22 people who died in Iron Ridge had already died. Nothing that happened now could change that. What could change was whether anyone was ever held accountable for the conditions that killed them. Pruitt, Holt said, the Inspector General's office at the Pentagon level, the one that operates independently of command authority. What is the process for submitting an evidentiary record to that office? Pruitt was quiet for 3 seconds. A formal submission requires a cover statement supporting documentation and a chain of custody certification for any physical or recorded evidence. Once received and logged, the submission is assigned an inquiry number and a supervising officer. At that point, the investigation is formally initiated and cannot be suspended or redirected by any command authority below the level of the Secretary of Defense. Another pause. The process is designed specifically to protect submissions from command interference. How long does the submission take? If the documentation is already assembled and the cover statement is prepared, the electronic submission can be completed in under 20 minutes. Once logged and the inquiry number is assigned, it is on record and cannot be recalled. Holt looked at him for a long moment. How long have you had that documentation assembled? 18 months, sir. The answer carried everything. The documentation had been ready for 18 months. The submission had not been made because the submission was not Pruitt's to make. It was Rachel's. And Rachel had not made it because the timing was not yet right, because 17 missions were not enough, or because the moment had not arrived in the specific form she had been waiting for. Until last night, until Bravo 7, until a mission witnessed by enough people in an official operations room that the submission would land with the weight of something that had just happened rather than something someone was trying to reconstruct from memory. She had timed it, exactly as Holt had said. Get the documentation ready for submission, he said. Do not submit it yet, but have it ready to go in under 5 minutes on my word. Yes, sir. He walked back into the operations room and looked out at the flight line. He could see the auxiliary strip at A-17 from here, the old A-10 sitting at its end, quiet and patient in the full morning light. He thought about 90 minutes. About Brower's aircraft descending through desert air toward this base with whatever Brower intended to accomplish when he landed. The certainty that rank would do the work, that 3 stars arriving at a subordinate's installation would be sufficient to close the doors that needed closing before anything irreversible could happen. He thought about what Brower didn't know. Brower's aircraft landed at 10:47. He came through the operations building without entourage, just an aide and a security officer. His face was the face of a man who had made a decision about this situation before he boarded the aircraft and was now implementing it with the efficiency of someone who did not anticipate significant resistance. He was 59 years old and he wore 3 stars the way they are worn by people who have carried the rank long enough that it has become part of their physical presence. Holt met him at the door and they shook hands with the handshake of 2 men who respect each other's position without necessarily respecting each other's current intentions. They went to the briefing room. Brower sat down and looked at the table. The folders were still there. He looked at them for a moment and then at Holt with the expression of a man who has just registered the terrain of a situation and is adjusting his approach. I understand you had an unauthorized flight operation last night, Brower said. A 10 without clearance, unregistered aircraft pilot unaccounted for. I am here to help you process that correctly and ensure the appropriate documentation is filed. Holt sat across from him. I appreciate that, sir. The aircraft at A-17 will need to be impounded as a matter of security protocol. I have arranged for a transport team to take custody of it this afternoon. Chain of evidence. Any materials found in or with the aircraft fall under that same protocol. Holt looked at him calmly. I understand, sir. Good. Brower's tone shifted. The call sign that was logged. Raven 13. I want to make sure that any references to that call signed in last night's operational record are noted as unverified and non-attributable. Standard procedure for unauthorized operations. Holt was quiet for a moment. General, before we proceed, I want to make sure I understand the situation fully. Are you here in an official investigative capacity or in an advisory one? Brower looked at him, a slight recalibration behind the eyes. Advisory at this stage. This is an informal coordination. I see. Holt kept his voice even, professionally neutral. I ask because the documentation we assembled overnight covers a number of elements that go beyond last night's flight operation. And I want to make sure that any steps we take are consistent with the requirements of whatever formal process may apply. Brower was still. What kind of documentation? Hold open the first folder. He turned it so the contents faced Brower. He said nothing. He let the general read. What Brower saw was the first of 17 mission files, the cancellation order at the top, the outcome record below it. He turned the page. The second mission. The third. He did not read quickly. He read with the attention of someone who understands exactly what they are looking at and is calculating in real time the distance between where they are and where they need to be. He got to the fifth mission and stopped. He set the folder down. He looked at Holt with an expression that had changed in a specific way. The confidence was still there. It would take more than a folder to move the confidence of a man who had spent 30 years building it. But something had shifted at its edges. The first sign of a man updating his assessment of the terrain. Warren, Brower said. His voice had changed register, not threatening, not warm. The register of someone who has decided to have a different conversation than the one they came in prepared for. I understand how this looks, and I want to tell you something I believe you are experienced enough to hear correctly. He paused. Command decisions in active threat environments involve variables that are not visible in a retrospective review. The stand down at Iron Ridge was a legitimate command decision made with the information available at that time. The assessment was that further rescue attempts would cost more lives than they saved. That assessment may have been wrong. Command decisions sometimes are, but wrong and culpable are not the same thing. Holt listened to this. Brower continued. The pilot who flew those unauthorized missions produced positive outcomes in some cases. That does not retroactively legitimize the choices. The military functions because command authority is maintained. When individuals substitute their own judgment for command authority, regardless of outcome, the institution itself is compromised. That is not abstract. That is the operational reality of maintaining a functioning force. He wasn't entirely wrong. Holt had known since the previous night that Brower wasn't entirely wrong. The argument was coherent. It was the logic of institutions, which was the logic that kept institutions functioning, and which was at its outer limit, the logic that had left 18 people in a field and called it arithmetic. I hear you, sir, Holt said. With respect, I want to make sure you are aware of something before we continue. He looked toward the door. Pruitt was standing there. Holt gave a single nod. 18 months ago, Holt said, documentation relating to Iron Ridge and the 17 subsequent operations was prepared for potential submission to the Inspector General's office. That documentation includes the pre-mission intelligence assessment for Iron Ridge and the authorization signatures on that assessment. It includes the stand-down order and the separation order. It includes outcome records for all 17 unauthorized missions certified against official extraction reports. He paused. It also includes audio recording from the final Iron Ridge sortie. Brower was very still. That documentation has not yet been submitted, Holt said, but it is assembled and can be filed in under 5 minutes. The briefing room was quiet in the specific way of a space where the balance of a conversation has just shifted and everyone present understands it. Brower looked at the table, at the folders. He was performing a calculation. Holt could see it happening and understood that it was genuine, not bluster, not theater, a real assessment of variables that had changed significantly in the last 60 seconds. He was about to speak when the door opened. The security officer at the front of the building had sent word 30 seconds earlier. A woman had arrived at the main gate. She had given her name. She had asked to speak to the commanding officer. She had no identification appearing in any current military record. She had asked calmly and without urgency to be brought to the operations building. She walked into the briefing room in civilian clothes. Jeans and a worn canvas jacket and boots that had been resold at some point. 42 years old, medium height, the kind of physical stillness that comes not from passivity, but from the long practice of conserving energy for when it is needed. A small scar above her left eye faded, but present the kind of scar that settles into a face and becomes part of it over time. She looked at Holt, then at Brower. Her expression did not change when she saw Brower. She had known he would be here, or something like him. She had planned for that too. She sat down at the table without being asked. Brower looked at her. Something moved across his face that was not quite recognizable. Not guilt. Guilt is a thing that happens quickly and is over. Something older than guilt. The expression of a man looking at the consequence of a decision he made 3 years ago, sitting across a table from him in a canvas jacket, olive and present, and entirely unhurried. Holt said her name, not as a question, as a confirmation. She said yes. Then she looked at Brower directly. General, I want you to know that I am not here because you came. You came because I am here. She said it without heat, without satisfaction, as a statement of operational fact. The submission to the Inspector General was filed 2 weeks ago, not by Specialist Pruitt, by me through my own channel. The inquiry number was assigned 11 days ago. The supervising officer has been reviewing the documentation for 9 days. She paused. This process cannot be redirected by any command authority below the level of the Secretary of Defense. I believe you know that, sir. Brower looked at her for a long time. The calculation was finished. You could see that it was finished because the expression on his face was no longer the expression of a man calculating. It was the expression of a man who has arrived at his answer and is now deciding who he is going to be in response to it. He did not say anything, and in not saying anything, Holt thought he was, for perhaps the first time in this entire story, being accurate. Rachel looked at Holt. Then she looked down at the table, at the wing pin sitting at its edge. She looked at it for a moment without touching it. Then she looked back up. Holt picked up the wing pin and set it in the center of the table between them. She looked at it. A moment. Something moved across her face that she did not try to stop. Not grief, not relief. Something that didn't have a name because it was too specific to the exact combination of things that had brought this pin to this table in this room on this morning. She looked at it for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she looked up at Holt and gave one small nod. The nod of one professional to another. Of one person who has kept something difficult to another person who has just demonstrated that they understood what it cost. The door opened again. The duty officer, carrying a small package, bubble wrap around something flat and rigid. He had the expression of a man who does not entirely understand what he is delivering, but understands that it matters. This just came in through base mail, sir, addressed to Raven, 13 Langford Air Base, no return address. He set it on the table and withdrew. Holt looked at Rachel. She nodded once. He opened it. Inside the bubble wrap was a patch, cloth, roughly 4 inches across. The stitching was not factory work. It was handmade, the kind of stitching that happens when someone who is not a tailor needs to make something and decides that imperfect and personal is better than nothing at all. The thread was slightly uneven, the letters slightly irregular. Made in the field or close to it by someone for whom the making of it mattered enough to do it without the right materials and send it anyway. The patch showed a silhouette, an A-10 in profile low over terrain, and beneath the silhouette in those hand-stitched letters, Raven 13. She saw us before radar did. Holt set it on the table next to the wing pin. Rachel looked at it for a long time. Her hands were flat on the table in front of her, very still. She looked at the patch with the full attention of someone who had prepared carefully for many things and had not prepared for this one. The stillness in her face was the stillness of someone doing the quiet work of absorbing something unexpected. Not dramatic, just human, just completely real. Nobody said anything for a long time. Then Holt said quietly, "What do you want, Captain?" She looked up from the patch. She thought about the question with genuine honesty, not performing consideration, but actually considering it. After 3 years of operating without anyone asking her that question, the asking of it required a real answer. "I do not need to be reinstated," she said. "I do not need a formal record corrected. I do not need anything that requires the institution to admit something it is not ready to admit." She paused. "What I need is for the next time someone calls for help and the official answer is that the risk is too high, there is still a frequency they can reach. A channel that stays open. Not on any roster, not in any official capacity. Just open." Holt looked at her. "That is all," he said. "That is everything," she said. Brower left Langford that afternoon without the transport team and without the A-10 and without the folders. He left with the knowledge that the inquiry was already on record and that the record could not be altered by anything available to him. He did not say much on his way out. There was not much to say. What followed happened over days and then weeks and then in the slower time of institutional process which moves at its own pace and cannot be hurried by anything except the weight of documentation and the number of people willing to stand behind it. General Clifton Brower was summoned to the Inspector General's office 12 days after Rachel walked into Langford. He appeared as required. He brought counsel. The inquiry was formal, independent, and conducted with the thoroughness the documentation warranted. The pre-mission intelligence assessment for Iron Ridge was reviewed. The authorization signatures were examined. The stand-down order and the separation order were reviewed against each other and against the outcome records Pruitt had assembled. The audio recording was admitted as evidence and heard by the supervising officer and the full inquiry panel. 14 of the 18 Iron Ridge survivors submitted statements. They had been located by the supervising officer's staff over the preceding weeks, and almost all of them said yes immediately when asked. Some of them had been waiting 3 years to say yes to exactly that question. A few sent the wingpins back as physical exhibits, slim pieces of scratched metal arriving in official envelopes from addresses spread across the country, each one carrying the weight of a thing that had been kept carefully and delivered to the right place at the right time. The inquiry findings were not made public. They never are at that level. What moved through the institution in the subsequent months was the knowledge that moves through institutions when something has happened that cannot be fully discussed and cannot be entirely suppressed. Brower's next promotion did not come through. His advisory role at the Pentagon contracted. The decisions made in his office were reviewed with a scrutiny they had not previously received. Nothing dramatic, nothing that made the papers. Just the slow and patient adjustment of a system being corrected from the inside by people who understood where the pressure needed to be applied and how long it needed to be held. Holt moved the A-10 from A-17 to Hangar 7 on the afternoon after Rachel's arrival. He did not process it into the official inventory. He logged it in a separate ledger he kept in his own desk, handwritten one-line reserve asset. Emergency use only. No additional designation, no unit assignment, no pilot of record. He issued one instruction about Hangar 7 verbally and did not put it in writing. The instruction was simple. The door would not be locked after 2300 hours. No security patrol would be assigned to the immediate perimeter between 2300 and 0500. If any maintenance activity was observed during those hours, it was not to be logged, reported, or interrupted. His deputy asked what to call the arrangement. Holt thought about it for a moment. Insurance, he said, for when the system does not show up. Nobody asked more questions. Over the following weeks, the ground crews at Langford noticed the same thing repeatedly. The aircraft in Hangar 7 was always clean, always serviced, always armed and fueled to full operational readiness without a single maintenance order ever being filed. The crew chief who first noticed it reported it to Holt directly more out of professional admiration than concern. Someone who knows these systems better than we do, he said. Holt told him to make sure the hangar had adequate lighting and that the tool inventory was always restocked and to leave everything else alone. The patch from Bravo 7 was framed, not by official order. A maintenance sergeant with some woodworking ability built a simple frame from scrap lumber and mounted it with glass from a salvaged picture frame, and it ended up on the wall of the operations room where the duty officers could see it from their consoles. Nobody ordered this. It appeared one morning and nobody moved it. The plaque was different. The plaque was deliberate. Holt ordered it himself and specified exactly what it would say and what it would not say. No photograph, no full name. A silhouette of an A-10 in profile low over terrain. Beneath the silhouette, one line. She didn't break the rules. She exposed what the rules were protecting. It went up on the wall adjacent to the operations floor entrance. Pilots coming in and out of the building passed it every time. New personnel were not given a formal briefing on it. They were told informally by whoever happened to be present when they first stopped to read it. The telling was always the same in its essential elements, regardless of who did the telling. There was a pilot. She was told to stand down. She flew anyway. She did this 17 times over 3 years and then came back to this building and asked for nothing except that the frequency stay open. Decker was the last one in the briefing room the day Rachel left. He stood at the table for a moment looking at the 17 mission folders still spread across its length, the full record of 3 years laid out in sequence. Then he picked up the first folder and aligned it neatly with the edge of the table. Then the second, then the third. He squared them all into a single clean stack, the way a man tidies something when he does not know what else to do with what is in his hands. He carried the stack to Holt's office and set it on the desk without a word. On his way out, he passed the plaque. He stopped, read it once slowly. Then he nodded to himself with the small economical motion of a man who has spent 61 years deciding what deserved acknowledgement and had arrived at a reliable standard. He had said something to Holt that morning in the hangar, standing at the entrance, while Holt climbed down the ladder with Rachel's note in his hand. He had waited until Holt was on the ground and had said it once and not repeated it because he was not a man who repeated things that had been heard. You know what separates the ones who do it from the ones who talk about it? The ones who do it have already accepted that they might not get credit. They made that peace before they took off. Then he had walked back toward the operations building without looking back. He did not need to. Holt had stood alone in the hangar after that. He held Rachel's note in one hand and the wing pin in the other, and he stood there long enough that the morning light moved across the hangar floor by a measurable distance. The note was written on a plain index card in a clean, spare hand, the handwriting of someone taught to write carefully and who had retained the habit. Thank you for knowing that some things matter more than the paperwork around them. And thank you for leaving the door open. Signed with 2 letters, R.A. He had read it 3 times. Then he climbed back up the ladder and opened the canopy and set the index card back on the seat where he had found it. He set the wing pin down next to it, both of them together where they would be found by the only person who would understand exactly why they were there side by side. He climbed back down, closed the canopy, walked out into the Nevada morning. The plaque was there when he passed it. He did not slow down. But he read it the way you read something you wrote yourself and are still deciding whether you got it right. He decided he had. In the years that followed, the ritual was simple and unwritten. A new pilot would stop in front of the plaque. An older one would eventually appear beside them. The story would be told in whatever words came naturally, but it always contained the same things: a woman, an aircraft that did not exist on paper, 17 missions that the institution had decided were impossible, and a case file 3 years in the making, filed through a channel that no amount of rank could close. Is she still out there? The new pilots would ask. The older ones would answer the same way every time. Not because they had rehearsed it, because it was true in the way that some things are true without requiring proof. She flies when she is needed. The hangar door stayed open. The frequency stayed live. And in the operations room between the duty consoles and the plaque on the wall, there was a framed patch. Handmade stitching, uneven letters, and A-10 silhouette low over terrain. 14 men had made it in the field with whatever thread and cloth they had, because some debts cannot wait for the right materials, and some things need to be made imperfectly and immediately rather than perfectly, and never. Raven 13. She saw us before radar did. Nobody ever moved it. Nobody ever explained it to visitors in anything more than the essential facts. Nobody needed to. Somewhere in the country or above it, where the terrain folds and the radar loses things in the clutter of hills and distance, there were people who were alive and going about their days because someone had looked at the arithmetic that said they were not worth the risk and had decided that the arithmetic was wrong and had spent 3 years proving it one mission at a time, and then walked into a room and asked for nothing except that a door be left open. They would never know her name. They knew what they needed to know. She saw them before the radar did. And she came anyway. And she came back. And somewhere out there in the specific silence of a very old aircraft, kept in perfect readiness, by hands that worked only when no one was watching, she was still coming. When she was needed, she was there.